You already know how this ends, or you think you do. November 1918, Germany is losing the war. The fleet mutinies at Kiel, the strikes spread inland, and in Berlin the government runs out of time. On the 9th of November, the Chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, announces that the Kaiser has abdicated. He announces it before the Kaiser has agreed to anything. Wilhelm II is at army headquarters in Belgium when he learns that he has, apparently, already stopped being emperor. The next morning, he crosses into the neutral Netherlands, not a midnight escape. He goes by car and spends much of the day waiting at a railway siding at Easden while the Dutch government works out what to do with him. He does not sign his own abdication until the 28th of November, 3 weeks after Berlin told the world he had. And that is the version you know. An empire ends, a republic begins. The palaces become museums, the crown becomes a display case, and the family that had ruled in Brandenburg since the 15th century goes quietly into private life. Here's what that version leaves out. In the autumn of 1919, a convoy of railway freight wagons left Berlin and Potsdam heading west. Inside were the contents of the imperial residences: furniture, paintings, silver, porcelain, glass. Around 30,000 objects according to the accounts we have. They were not seized. They were not smuggled. They were sent with the permission of the Republic that had just replaced the monarchy across an international border to the deposed emperor in the Netherlands. And 7 years after that, the German state sat down with the family it had overthrown and signed a contract giving them back 39 castles. Now hold on to that, because it gets stranger. In the summer of 1926, the German people were asked directly whether the property of their former royal houses should be taken away without a single mark in compensation. 14.5 million of them voted yes. That was 96% of every valid ballot. The measure failed anyway, and the argument that vote was supposed to settle was still running in a German administrative court in 2023, 97 years later, 4 constitutions later, in a country that had been founded, destroyed, divided, and reunified in the meantime. So here's the question this video exists to answer. When a state collapses, we are used to asking what happens to its debts. Almost nobody asks the other question. What happens to what it owned? Let me be precise about what I'm claiming, because there is a crude version of this story circulating, and I am not going to sell you that one. Nobody smuggled a fortune out of Germany in the dark. There is no hidden vault. Every document in this story is public: the seizure orders, the settlement law, the referendum returns, the expert reports. Some of it was debated in the Bundestag on camera. The mechanism is not a conspiracy. The mechanism is a constitution. The German Republic of 1919 was built by people who had just watched a revolution and who were terrified of another one. So they wrote property rights into their founding document in strong terms, and they built courts to enforce them. Those guarantees did not come with an exception for the family that had just been removed from power, and that turned out to matter enormously because it meant the new republic could not simply take. It had to prove, argue, and eventually pay. I want to flag something now because I got this wrong when I started. I assumed the republic chose leniency, that a nervous new government decided not to pick a fight with the old elite. That is not what happened, and the true version is worse. The republic tried to take the property, it was beaten, and I will show you exactly where and how. But to understand why the fight was so hard to win, you first have to understand something almost nobody explains. In 1918, nobody actually knew what the royal family owned. Not the family, not the government, not the courts. Because Prussian royal money was not one pot. It was 3, and the walls between them had been left deliberately vague for 100 years. The first pot was the Kronfideikommiss, the crown entail, land and assets tied to the office of king, not to the man, inalienable. It passed to whoever held the throne. In 1914, it carried a book value of a little under 28 million marks. The second pot was the house entail, property belonging to the dynasty as a family, including its junior branches, not the states, not any one person's. The third pot was simple private wealth, what the man himself owned, the way you own a house. And here's the critical detail that changes everything about this story. Under the arrangement Prussia set up in 1820, the royal court was not funded by a line in the state budget the way a modern civil list works. It was funded directly out of the revenues of the crown domains. Think about what that means in practice. The money never appeared in a public account anybody could inspect. There was no annual statement separating the king's money from the kingdom's money, because for 100 years there had been no reason to make one. The king and the state were the same institution. Asking which of them owned a forest in Brandenburg was like asking which of your hands owns your wallet. Then, in a single week in November 1918, they stopped being the same institution, and the question became worth a fortune. At which point the obvious objection arrives, and you should raise it. There had just been a revolution. The monarchy was gone. Why did the new government not simply take everything and be done with it? The answer is that the men in charge in November 1918 were not trying to make a revolution. They were trying to end one. The Provisional Government was a coalition of Social Democrats and independent Social Democrats, and its leadership had one overriding priority: preventing Germany from following Russia. There was an army to demobilize, roughly 6 million men to bring home and feed, an Allied blockade still in force, and armed councils forming in every major city. So the new government made its choices accordingly. It came to an understanding with the officer corps. It kept the imperial civil service at their desks. It kept the imperial judges on their benches. Almost nothing about the German state was rebuilt from the ground up, because rebuilding it would have meant months of paralysis in a winter the country might not survive. A wholesale seizure of the property of the ruling houses would have required exactly the kind of revolutionary authority the government had decided not to claim. And when the Constitution was written the following year, the question was settled in a way that shaped everything after it. The Constitution protected property. It allowed expropriation only for the public good on a legal basis and against appropriate compensation. But it left exactly one door open. A law of the Reich could set the compensation rule aside. So taking without paying was not impossible. In Weimar Germany, it was possible in precisely one way, by act of the National Parliament, and the rest of this story is about how hard that one way turned out to be. The new Prussian government moved fast. On the 13th of November, it seized the assets of the crown and tail. On the 30th, it went further and seized everything, the entire special property of the former king, of the royal house, and of its individual members, anywhere in Prussia.
That sounds decisive. It was not a confiscation.
It was custody. The state took control of the assets and handed administration to its finance ministry, while the ownership question got sorted out. A holding action meant to last months. It lasted 8 years. And while the lawyers argued in Berlin, the wagons were already moving west, because there was a second track running alongside the legal fight, and it concerned the things you could load onto a train. Wilhelm was at Amerongen first, then at Doorn, a manor house in the Dutch countryside he bought and moved into. In January 1920, the Allies formally demanded his extradition. The Treaty of Versailles had named him first on its list of men to be tried. The Dutch government refused, and kept refusing. So he stayed. Confined to a radius of a few kilometers, his correspondents watched, forbidden to make political statements, and into that house came the contents of his old life. The number of wagons is one of those figures that is hardened through repetition, and the truth behind it is better than the number. 59 is the count usually given for the release authorized in 1919, signed off by Prussia's Social Democratic finance minister. The museum at Doorn counts 64 wagons arriving at the station at Zeist, with transports running from September 1919 all the way to February 1922. Same operation, different endpoints, which is why you will see both numbers quoted and why neither of them is wrong. What is not in doubt is the scale. Tens of thousands of objects moved in stages over more than 2 years. What matters about it is the legal footing. This was a separate arrangement from the land question, a deal about movable property, agreed while the argument over the estates was still wide open, which tells you something about the position the Republic had already taken, perhaps without meaning to. 6 months after removing a monarch, it was treating him as a private owner with property to be delivered. That is not an accusation. It is a description of a legal reality that the new Germany had written for itself, and it is where the money story really begins. And notice the position this created, because it is unusual, and it mattered later. The Allies had put Wilhelm at the head of the list of men to be tried under the peace treaty. The Dutch would not hand him over. So he sat in a country that would not extradite him, holding movable property that a German government had formally released to him, while the argument over the immovable property continued in Berlin without him. He could not be tried. He could not be reached. And whatever the Prussian finance ministry eventually decided about the estates, the contents of the palaces were already outside German jurisdiction. That is a lesson that repeats across this whole series, and it is worth naming plainly. Movable wealth leaves first. It always leaves first. Land and buildings have to wait for lawyers, but furniture only has to wait for a train. Because in 1925, the courts made that reality impossible to ignore. The Weimar Constitution protected property. Expropriation was allowed only for the public good, on a legal basis, and this is the phrase that decided everything against appropriate compensation. So the princely houses of Germany went to court, and they won. Not occasionally, routinely. The judiciary of the Weimar Republic had been inherited whole from the empire. The men on the bench had been appointed by the monarchy and had no particular affection for the state that now employed them. Case after case went the same way. Then, in June 1925, came the ruling that lit the fuse. The Supreme Court of the Reich struck down the state law that had seized the property of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha and returned 37.2 million goldmarks. Put that number next to the country it was awarded in. Germany was 2 years past the worst hyperinflation in the history of an industrial economy. Households had watched savings built across a generation evaporate inside a few months. Pensions had gone. Insurance policies had gone. Mortgages had been wiped out and then, by a separate legal fight, only partially restored. And here is the comparison that made it unbearable, because it was not hypothetical. Germany had spent the previous 2 years fighting bitterly over whether old debts wiped out by inflation should be revalued, whether a mortgage or a savings bond written in gold-backed marks before the war should be honored at something better than nothing. The government's initial position had been that they should not paying old obligations in real money would have wrecked the new currency and the budget along with it. It took a revolt inside the Reichstag and a mass movement of savers to force a partial revaluation law through in 1925, and partial is the operative word. Most creditors recovered a fraction of what they had lost years late after a public fight. So the sequence Germans actually experienced was this. A saver who had lent money to the state in good faith before the war was told there was a limit to what the law could restore. And in the same year, in the same country, under the same constitution, a princely house was awarded 37.2 million goldmarks. Ordinary Germans had been told that their losses were the unavoidable price of a national catastrophe, and a court had just found that one princely family's losses were not. That is the moment the argument stopped being about law and became about legitimacy. And this is where I have to correct the assumption I flagged earlier, because what happened next was not a republic quietly choosing to accommodate the old dynasties. It was the largest attempt at expropriation in German democratic history. In the autumn of 1925, the Communist Party launched a petition to expropriate the property of the former ruling houses without any compensation at all. The Social Democrats joined late, and reluctantly, because they could see exactly how constitutionally dangerous it was. Under Weimar's rules, a petition needed signatures from 10% of the registered electorate to force a national vote. With roughly 39.4 million voters registered, that meant about 3.9 million signatures. In March 1926, they collected 12.5 million, more than 3 times the threshold. And I want to stop on the Social Democrats for a moment because their hesitation is the most revealing thing in the whole campaign. They were the largest party of the left. Their voters wanted this. And their leadership could see a trap that the communists either did not see or did not care about. The Weimar Republic was a constitutional order that the Social Democrats had built and that they were increasingly alone in defending. Its whole claim on the loyalty of ordinary Germans was that it protected people from arbitrary power, that a government could not take your property because it had decided you were the wrong sort of person. Now they were being asked to campaign for a law that would strip a named category of Germans of everything they owned without compensation by popular vote. The Reichstag had already tried the ordinary route and failed. A bill was drafted, the coalition could not carry it. So the choice was between a referendum on confiscation and no expropriation at all, and the Social Democrats took the referendum, knowing that they were campaigning for a targeted seizure under a constitution whose entire promise to ordinary Germans was that targeted seizures could not happen to them. They campaigned anyway. Nearly a third of everyone eligible to vote in Germany had put their name to the petition, and the question now went to a national referendum, set for June 20th. The opposition understood immediately that they could not win it on a straight count, so they did not try to. President Hindenburg weighed in from the top of the state. A letter of his, written in May and published 2 weeks before the vote, called the proposal a confiscation of property for political motives and a breach of the foundations of law. The Catholic and Protestant churches, the German National People's Party, the Bavarian People's Party, the agrarian associations, and the industrial federations all issued the same instruction.
Not vote no. Do not vote at all.
Because of how the rule was written, that was the winning move. The measure was classed as constitutional in effect, which meant it needed the support of an absolute majority of everyone registered, not a majority of those who turned out. Roughly 20 million yes votes. Under that rule, a ballot you never cast counted exactly like a no. Staying home was not abstention. It was opposition at zero cost, with no need to defend it publicly. On the 20th of June, 1926, 15.6 million Germans went to the polls. 14.5 million of them voted to expropriate the princes, 96% of every valid ballot. And it failed by about 5.5 million votes because the other 24 million people had been persuaded to do nothing. I want to be careful here because this result gets misreported in both directions. This was not a narrow defeat. The gap was enormous, but it was also not a rejection. Of 35 electoral districts, only 3 cleared the threshold. Nowhere did the German public vote against the measure in any meaningful number. The referendum did not lose an argument. It lost a quorum. And the consequence was immediate. The constitutional route was now closed permanently and publicly, which left exactly one way to end the 8-year deadlock.
A contract.
In October 1926, 4 months after the referendum, the Prussian state and the House of Hohenzollern signed a settlement, and the Prussian parliament passed it into law. The shape of that deal is the most instructive thing in this entire story, and it has nothing to do with sentiment. The state took the palaces. Berlin kept the great residences, the gardens, the parks, the theaters, the libraries, and the museum collections. The figures usually given are around 75 properties to the state and 39 returned to the family. Now, if your instinct is that the state won that exchange, look at what those categories actually are. Palaces, parks, and museums do not generate income, they consume it. Roofs, heating, staff, restoration, security, public access. In German, the negotiators had a word for this class of asset, Lastobjekte, burden object. Things whose value is real and whose cash flow is permanently negative. What went to the family was the other kind. Forest, farmland, productive estates, roughly 383,000 Morgen, an old Prussian land measure, against about 250,000 for the state, something close to a 60-40 split of the disputed land, in the family's favor. The Republic took the prestige and the maintenance bills, the dynasty took the revenue. And there is one more mechanical detail here that almost never gets mentioned, and it is the reason this settlement looks the way it does. It was paid in things, not money. Remember when this was signed? 3 years after the market died, 3 years after a currency that had been trusted for half a century became firewood. In 1923, the Rentenmark had come in at a rate of 1 to a trillion of the old paper marks. After an experience like that, no serious negotiator on either side of the table wanted to be paid in currency, or to promise payment in currency, over any horizon that mattered. So the settlement was executed almost entirely in real assets: land, buildings, timber, objects, Sachwerte. That is not a footnote. That is why a 1926 agreement was still generating litigation in the 21st century. A cash settlement would have been spent and forgotten inside a decade. A settlement in land and objects creates titles that outlive everyone who signed them. And there is one more feature of that contract, and it is the one that did the real long-term damage. It was left vague on purpose. 8 years of negotiation had exhausted everyone involved. Both sides needed a signature more than they needed precision. So on a great many individual items, particularly the movable ones, the paintings and the furniture, and the objects sitting in what were now public museums, the settlement recorded that the question was resolved without recording, item by item exactly how. Nobody was hiding anything. They were finishing. Anyone who has ever watched a long negotiation close knows the moment. The remaining disputes get folded into general language, on the shared assumption that the specifics will be sorted out administratively, and that nobody will ever need to reopen them. Except the specifics were never sorted out administratively. And 90 years later, when a lawyer went back to ask which of 10,000 objects had actually changed hands in 1926, and which had merely been left where they stood, the document could not answer. That ambiguity is not a scandal. It is the ordinary residue of an exhausted negotiation. But it is the reason this file could be reopened at all, and it is a warning about every settlement that ends a crisis. What you leave undefined does not disappear. It waits. And now I have to make the second correction, because if I stopped here, I would be telling you something false by implication. None of this was special treatment for the Hohenzollerns. After the referendum failed, the German states settled with their former dynasties one by one, 26 separate treaties, following the same logic almost everywhere. Bavaria had already done it in 1923, creating a compensation fund for the House of Wittelsbach that still exists and still operates today. Saxony, Hesse, Mecklenburg, and Lippe took years longer. The Prussian settlement was not an outlier, it was the German norm, applied to the largest estate. So if the deal was ordinary, why is this the one that was still in court in living memory? The answer has nothing to do with the deal at all, it has to do with a map. Because the productive estates the family kept in 1926 were overwhelmingly in the east. Brandenburg, Pomerania, the Prussian heartland. In the autumn of 1945, that land was in the Soviet occupation zone, and the land reform imposed there did what the referendum of 1926 had failed to do. Every holding above 100 hectares was expropriated, without compensation. Around 560,000 people received redistributed land. The Hohenzollern estates in the east, Rheinsberg, Cadenen, and the rest were simply gone. What survived was what happened to lie west of the line. The ancestral castle in Swabia, the lands around Sigmaringen, never touched because they were never in the Soviet zone. Compare that to the Wittelsbachs. Same starting position in the 1920s. Same kind of settlement 3 years earlier. Their property was in Bavaria. Bavaria was in the American zone. There was never a second act. 2 dynasties, 1 mechanism, opposite outcomes, and the only variable that mattered was longitude. And there the matter would have rested permanently, except that in 1990, Germany reunified, which meant the federal government had to decide what to do about property taken in the Soviet zone between 1945 and 1949. In 1994, it passed a compensation law, where those expropriations could not be reversed in kind, and most could not, the former owners or their heirs could claim a payment. But the law contained an exclusion clause, and everything turns on it. No compensation for anyone who, in the words of the statute, gave substantial support to the National Socialist system, or to the communist one. The German phrase is erheblichen Vorschub geleistet. Read that clause against this particular case, and you will see the strangest legal situation in this entire story. The current head of the house derives his claim through Crown Prince Wilhelm, the eldest son of the last Kaiser, who held the family property under the house rules and who died in 1951. Which means a German law written in 1994 made the ownership of thousands of objects depend on the political conduct of a man who had been dead for 43 years.
Not on what anyone alive had done, on what he did, in 1932 and 1933.
The law also attached a condition to any cultural property it handed back. For 20 years, such objects had to remain publicly accessible and available for research, a clock that started in 1994 and ran out in 2014. 2014 is also the year the head of the house opened quiet negotiations with the federal government, with Berlin and with Brandenburg. I want to make sure that lands, because it is the least dramatic and most explanatory fact in this entire story. The reason a century-old dispute erupted into the German press in the 2010s was not that anyone had a change of heart, or found a document, or decided the moment had come. It was a statutory clock finishing its run. That is what moves a great many of these cases, and it is almost never how they get reported. Not ambition, not dynastic revival, a date and a schedule, and a lawyer who had it marked. In 2019, a Berlin newspaper revealed the scale of what was being claimed, more than 10,000 objects, and the public foundations that hold those collections called the demands excessive. Now, the detail that almost every account of this affair got wrong, including the ones with the biggest headlines. Those 10,000 objects were not one category. Some of them were owned by the family and had been placed in state museums on loan, the ordinary arrangement by which a private collection ends up on a public wall. Others were objects the family argued had been taken from them in 1945 and never returned. Only the second category could ever generate a compensation claim under the 1994 law. The first category was a conversation about a loan agreement, which is a normal thing museums have with lenders every day of the week. The reporting mostly merged the two into a single enormous number, and that number is what the public reacted to, which meant that the loudest phase of this argument was conducted over a figure that did not describe what was actually in dispute. And to settle a question of law, both sides did something remarkable. They commissioned historians. 4 expert reports, 2 ordered by the state of Brandenburg, 2 by the family. Stefan Malinowski and Peter Brandt, for Brandenburg, concluded that Crown Prince Wilhelm had given substantial support to the Nazi system. Christopher Clark, writing in 2011, and Wolfram Peita with Rainer Orth for the family, concluded that he had not. Now here is the detail that makes this case genuinely fascinating, and it is not the one the headlines picked up. The 2 reports commissioned by the family do not agree with each other. Clark's argument was that Wilhelm was a marginal figure, politically irrelevant, incapable of affecting anything. Peita's argument was close to the opposite. In his account, Wilhelm was a serious political actor operating near the center of power, alongside figures like Kurt von Schleicher, but one who was working to keep Hitler out. Both of those cannot be true. Either the Crown Prince mattered, or he did not. 2 expert reports, commissioned by the same party, arriving at incompatible pictures of the same man. So what did the documents actually show? On the 3rd of April 1932, before the second round of the presidential election, Crown Prince Wilhelm publicly declared that he would vote for Adolf Hitler and urged others not to abstain. It was reported across Germany and abroad. It is the central exhibit, and nobody disputes that it happened. But notice what it does and does not establish. Hitler lost that election. Hindenburg won the runoff. A prestigious public endorsement is evidence of allegiance. It is not by itself evidence of consequence. On March 21, 1933, came the Day of Potsdam, the ceremony that dressed the new government in Prussian tradition, with the Crown Prince present in uniform. His brothers went further into the regime than he did. The picture the documents support is public, repeated, prestigious endorsement. What they do not directly establish is causation. And that gap is the whole case, because the statute does not ask whether a man approved of the regime. It asks whether he substantially advanced it. Erheblich is a legal threshold, not a historian's category. A historian can say with confidence that he helped, and still not be able to say whether he crossed a line drawn by a parliament 60 years later. One further point, and it matters for how you weigh all of this. Christopher Clark later revised his assessment. After Malinowski published his research on the Hohenzollerns and the Nazis, Clark publicly moved towards his conclusions about Wilhelm's role before 1933. He revised a historical judgment in light of new work. That is what historians are supposed to do, and it should not be described as a retraction, but it does tell you that even the experts on this file did not consider it closed. So, how did a century-long argument end? It did not. In March 2023, the head of the House withdrew the compensation proceedings and dropped the claim to around 4,000 of the disputed objects. The administrative court in Potsdam closed the file. In his own account, his great-grandfather's conduct was a relevant factor for those particular objects. In May 2025, a final agreement was reached. A public interest foundation took ownership of the disputed collections, keeping them in the museums of Berlin and Brandenburg, where they had been sitting all along, with the family holding a minority of seats on its board and retaining a small residue of objects. German press reporting put the value of the whole dispute in the low hundreds of millions of euros. I want to be clear that this figure was never confirmed by either party, and you should treat it as a journalist's estimate rather than a number anyone signed. But the ending that actually matters is not financial. It is this. No judge ever ruled on the question. The clause that governed everything, whether Crown Prince Wilhelm substantially advanced the Nazi system, was never tested in a courtroom because the claims were withdrawn before it could be. A century of argument, and the question at the center of it was closed without ever being answered. Now I want to be careful, because this is a story that attracts a version of itself that I do not accept. There is no secret here. Nothing was hidden. The seizure orders of 1918 are published. The settlement of 1926 is a law you can read. The referendum returns are official. The expert reports were published in full, and there was a parliamentary hearing on this subject in January 2020. This was one of the most thoroughly documented property disputes in modern European history. Whatever else it was not concealed. Second, I have not told you that a family put a regime in power, and I am not going to. The evidence does not support it, and the historians who have examined this most closely disagree even about the far weaker claim. What the record shows is a public endorsement in 1932. In an election, the endorsed candidate lost, followed by a ceremonial appearance in 1933. Serious historians read the significance of that differently, and I have given you both readings under the names of the people who made them. Third, and I think most important, nothing in this story is an argument about anyone alive. The legal question concerned the conduct of a man who died in 1951. Inherited property is not inherited guilt, and a compensation statute is not a moral verdict on a descendant. The villain here, if you want one, is not a family. It is a structural problem that every collapsing state runs into, and almost none of them solve in time. So what is the real lesson? It is that when a state falls, its debts are the easy part. Debts get renegotiated, inflated away, defaulted on, written down. Every empire in this series did some version of that. Property is different. Property produces titles, and a title is the single most durable thing any regime manufactures. It survives the government that issued it, and it can be enforced by the government that replaces it against that government's own interests. The German Republic learned this the hard way and paid for it twice. First in 1926, when the guarantees it had written to protect ordinary citizens from arbitrary seizure turned out to protect the dynasty it had just removed. 14.5 million people voted to make an exception, and the Constitution held. Then it paid again, in a way that was invisible at the time, by handing the profitable estates to the old ruling houses and keeping the loss-making palaces. Weimar left the men who most despised the Republic with a permanent, self-renewing income. The state financed the independence of its own opposition, and it did so lawfully because it could not see any lawful way to do otherwise. That is not a German problem. That is the problem with rules. They are only worth anything if they bind you when you would rather they did not. And there is one last thing, which is the part I cannot stop thinking about. Every state that has appeared in this series has a moment where the old order is defeated and the new one gets to write the terms. We tend to imagine that moment as total, a clean line where one world stops and another begins. It is never total. Something always crosses the line. In Austria, it was a creditor's lien. In Russia, it was a repudiated bond in a French drawer. Here it was a contract, signed by a republic, that had run out of options, that quietly turned the property of a crown into the property of a family. The empire ended in 1918. The paperwork took another 107 years. If you made it this far, drop a ballot box in the comments so I know you stayed to the end, because 14.5 million people voted in 1926, and it changed nothing, and I would like to know how that lands with you. And tell me this, if a constitution protects property from the state, should it protect the property of the people the state just removed from power? There is a serious argument on both sides, and I read every reply. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.